Hey, what is going on, YouTube? My name is David James, and thank you for tuning in to the first ever installment of The Deep End. In today's episode, we'll be going over and covering one of Joe Rogan's latest episodes with guest Tim Kennedy. And more specifically, we'll be covering an article that was released by Unilad UK that was kind of diagnosing some of the things that were said within the episode, but kind of in a biased way and really taking things out of context. And that's exactly what we're going to be discussing in today's first ever episode. So thank you again for tuning in, and I hope you all enjoy. So if you are already a fan of Joe Rogan and his content, you already know then that he is no stranger to controversy in terms of some of the things that he might talk about and the subject matters that may be jovially discussed throughout the course of his podcasts and his episodes or his stand-up special. The Unilad article in question was taking a look at a segment of the podcast where Joe Rogan and Tim Kennedy were discussing a bit that he had in his 2016 special Triggered. During this portion of the podcast, Joe Rogan was clearly discussing what it took basically to craft a bit or a good stand-up special. So taking a look at your content and what you'd be discussing and kind of breaking it down piece by piece to make sure that A, the joke hit, and that B, as he even says during this episode, that the joke is bulletproof. Here's where things get controversial. The bit in question was a bit pertaining to Caitlyn Jenner, a trans individual, aka a no-go. Where I took issue with this article was the way in which the actual conversation and the podcast as a whole was presented. The journalist took what was very, very much so a breakdown and explanation of the joke and as to how he even came up with the concept behind it as literal assaults on the trans community. Now, I would never ever advocate attacking any kinds of disenfranchised groups, but at the same time, I'm also a critical thinker, and I think most of us are. And most of us could have easily looked and watched that podcast and would have not seen what this individual took away from it, unless, of course, you read through this and then already didn't like Joe Rogan, and then I guess it was pretty easy. Within the article, they discuss two main things: dead naming and transphobia. On the topic of dead naming, once again, if this individual, which it's pretty clear to tell they did not, actually sat there and watched this episode, they would clearly be able to see, unless they are hearing impaired, which it doesn't seem like they are. I don't think anything in the article really expresses that the only time where he quote unquote dead names Caitlyn Jenner is when he's literally discussing as to how record books would showcase what the achievements of Caitlyn were when they went by the name of Bruce. That is not dead naming. That is an honest and actually a pretty valid question because, to be honest, I never really thought about that before. I don't think many people really did. I mean, we know Bruce Jenner as this Olympian gold medalist and a champion of the United States, but no one's really discussed how the record books are really going to cover that. Are we going to say that it was Caitlyn Jenner that did this? Or are we going to say that it was Bruce? I personally don't have a dog in the fight whatsoever in terms of who we want to say achieved what, but you can't really fault somebody for asking the question. I don't think there's anything wrong with kind of being inquisitive in that regard. It wasn't like he was trying to say that because now that they're Caitlyn Jenner, that everything should be wiped away. And it wasn't like they were trying to say that the record books shouldn't show that it was Caitlyn Jenner that did it. It was just a simple question. And this brings me to the main topic of this conversation: context. Context is everything. From the way that we just verbally communicate with each other, to the way that we express when we are displeased, when we are pleased, when we're angry, when we're sad. Context is very important when you're trying to look at what someone is saying and how they're saying it. And where does context go to die? Text-based format. There is almost no means in which through written text you can articulate context or what was even happening behind it. Even when you try to give back on information, if you don't have the actual audio or visual things to kind of also showcase the context, it's kind of all up to interpretation. Now, with that said, of course, there are certain things where you really don't need to have a lot of context because just in their plain format, they can be either full of vitriol or they can be very inflammatory even without having the background context. But in the case of the article, they're discussing a breakdown of a joke within a stand-up special. That right there definitely has to have context to it. And what I'm really referring to is in the article when he actually starts to talk about the bit and kind of what the punchline was, what everything was there, there's no context there. Now, if you actually watch the video, you can clearly tell that it's a joke. They're laughing. He's laughing. It clearly is no malice there. He has no hate towards Caitlyn Jenner or the Kardashian family. He does not have that. It is a joke. Now, I know that in 2020, jokes are kind of a no-go right now, at least most of them, unless you're sitting up there bashing MAGA people. You really can't make jokes, but let's be real, the MAGA jokes only are funny for so long before we all kind of get sick of them because we've heard them all. I mean, I personally like new content. Now, by no means am I trying to say that in order for you to have a joke that it has to be offensive or it has to belittle people or anything like that, but comedy is comedy. It's all up to interpretation. And to cherry pick certain lines or certain phrases just to kind of fit a narrative, I feel like it's extraordinarily disingenuous and it's really hurting the very people that you're trying to inform or educate on topics or issues. Then what also bothered me about this topic or this article was that not only was the actual journalist giving their take back and their feedback on this podcast episode and what had happened, but then they also brought in, I guess, an interview that had taken place with Caitlyn Jenner where she was discussing this particular stand-up special and I guess this episode, whatever the case would be. Caitlyn was obviously not happy with the joke that was made. They voiced that they thought Joe Rogan was an ass and that he was transphobic and homophobic. And then on top of that, kind of attacked what his whole cultural impact really was and kind of compared that to, her daughters. And basically was saying that they had more of an impact on society than Joe Rogan. And this is kind of where I took issue. It's one thing to not approve of a comment that somebody made. But when your measuring factors as to what someone's impact is are their money, their followers, their fans, that should not be an indication of what someone's impact is. I mean, if you really want to be real about this, Joe Rogan's podcast, albeit, yes, are there guests there that I disagree with? Are there guests on there that I like? All the time. But that's what's special about it. It's allowing people to actually be able to see both sides of a conversation and critically think and to be able to find where they lie within the conversation or the discourse. That is very impactful, extraordinarily impactful. And on top of that, Joe Rogan's human just like all of us. Every single day, he's learning and growing, just as all of us should be. So yeah, there are times where he says some completely asinine things? Sure, just like all of us. Are there times where he says offensive things? Sure, just like all of us. If you really want to talk about impacts, I would say just a positive ones. Joe Rogan is heads and tails above the Kardashians. I mean, I get they were trying to build a brand and, shout out to Kris Jenner. I mean, she's a matriarch of that family. I mean, to take what was there and kind of make that into this empire they had now is absolutely incredible. And I would never fault her or her children for that. But let's also talk about the other impacts if we really want to get down to it. Suicide rates are up. Body dysmorphia is at an all-time high. There is this unrealistic standard that all of these young girls are now trying to achieve, not 100% because of the Kardashians, but they are a major factor within that. So what? Do we want to say that, the Kardashians have more of an impact because they've created this ideal woman that is not realistic? They've helped to propel materialism and in an unbelievable fashion. Are those the things that we really want to sit here and be like, yeah, that's what makes you impactful? Great job. Awesome. No. Now, if we want to talk about Kim Kardashian getting people out of prison, we got a different conversation. But again, to bring this full circle, context matters. Context is important. And in the case of this journalist, I mean, I'm sorry. How can you sit there and watch something like that and then write up an article like that is going to go out to a massive amount of people and just completely mislead them? I mean, it'd be one thing if you were to say, hey, I didn't really feel like I liked this article or I didn't like this joke, whatever the case is. But no, you had to spin it. You had to coerce it. You had to perverse it to make it seem like they were just going in on trans people. They were just going in on women. They hated everybody. That's the way that your article reads. And I know for a fact that they meant to do that. I've been victim of that myself. Clicks, reactions, that's all that matters. Unfortunately, the truth can kind of die by the wayside. And as long as the money's flowing in there and the accolades are going to these journalists, who cares about the truth? I guess it really doesn't matter. When you got a platform with a bunch of likes, bunch of hearts on your name, or whatever the case is, you can just be a bullshitter and it's fine. It's just not for me. But hey, I want to thank all of you for tuning in to the very first installment of The Deep End. I'm going to try to be releasing content here pretty frequently, ranging from not just posts like this, but also viral memes, political, apolitical, whatever the case is. I just kind of want to give my feedback, but also I really want to promote people to critically think. I don't want people to watch my content or view my content and think that I know all the answers or I have all the answers or my takes are always right. I do not want that. What I want is for people to view my content, see where maybe I'm coming from, but then to also look at it from their own lens. Be critical. And I don't mean sitting there in the comment section bashing me, which whatever, go for it. But what I mean is truly, truly, truly critically think about the topics at hand. The meme that you might be about to share, the article that you just read. Think. Don't let them just think for you. And when I say them, I'm not just talking about journalists. I'm talking about other people on the YouTubes who are sitting there acting like they have all the answers. Anyone that pretends they have all the answers, run for the hills. Run for the hills. Because guess what? They don't really care about making sure that you know what's really right or what's wrong. What they care about is the fact that you click on their videos, you bring them ad revenue, and you keep that money flowing into their pockets. And unfortunately, they'll lead you down the hill of destruction for that dollar. And maybe, if I can be that person who can kind of help steer people away from just, well, I hate saying this, being a sheep, but whatever the case, here I am. Thanks again for tuning in. My name is David James, and I'll catch you next time on The Deep End.